Hello. This lecture is how to give a closing proposition speech for the classic online format of debate. In the proposition speech, you only have 2 minutes to give your final closing speech on why you deserve to win the round. This means that you have significantly less time than the opposition has, which in one sense puts you in a disadvantage. However, working for you on your side is the fact that the opposition has already revealed their hand, so they know why, or at least you know, why they think they win the round, whereas when they're giving their closing speech, they don't know the arguments that you might go for why you win the round. So while you have less time, you have the strategic advantage of being the one who is able to speak last, which allows you to effectively frame the debate so that way the judge remembers your words and not your opposition's words, which is why you have to utilize those 2 minutes effectively in order to get across those main points that can win you the round. When thinking through how to give the proposition closing speech, you need to think about how to effectively answer and prioritize the opposition's argument, because you do not have time to answer everything that they've said, but you do have time to answer the general thesis and the major points that they want to win the round on. So when you start to prepare for your speech, you should ask yourself 2 questions. The first question is, how can you win the round? When you think about how you can win the round, there are a couple of things you can consider. The first thing you can consider is, what is your best argument? Essentially, what arguments did you make in your constructive and rebuttal speeches that are the most strategic and the best arguments that have the best warrants that are well articulated? That means that regardless of what topic you happen to be arguing for, at the start of the debate you've made a diversity of arguments. Not all of those arguments are necessarily round winners. Some of those arguments were things that you could theoretically win on, or arguments that you were just sort of throwing out there as strategic benefits in order to try and bog down your opponent on arguments that are not necessarily your best. When you only have 2 minutes of time, you don't have time to make decoy or straw person arguments. Rather, you need to focus all of your time on the exact argument that you think will be able to win your round, that was articulated the clearest, and that you're most persuasive at being able to articulate. That means that even if there might be another argument that is good in the debate round, but you're not able to effectively convince others that it is the best argument, you should probably not utilize that argument in your closing speech because of the time constraints that you have. Another thing that you consider when determining how you can win the round is, what did your opponent screw up on? That means listening to your opposition's closing speech and figuring out which arguments you made in the rebuttals that they didn't answer or they incredibly mishandled. Now, these arguments that are not answered or are mishandled may not necessarily be your best arguments in the round, but if they are mishandled so poorly and or are completely conceded, that means that they could become your best arguments in the round if you could provide the warrants for why you should win the debate round as a result of them. That means that after listening to their speech, you should think through how you should win the round as a result of that as a result of the opposition's closing speech, and not necessarily just go on what you thought you were going to go win the round on when you started the debate. So what is actually useful to do is not only rewatch the videos that you have given previously to see the way that you've articulated arguments prior, but also rewatching the videos that your opponent makes to figure out what they aren't effectively answering. So that way in your last speech, you could tell the judge that, listen, judge, they have not answered this argument. When they concede this argument, we should win the round because, and then you insert the warrants why that argument should win you the round. Now, if they screw up on an argument or they don't answer an argument that is absolutely horrible, in an online format, unlike a policy format, you should not necessarily just go for the argument because it's conceded. A conceded argument will always have weight in a sort of online format or a lay style of debate, but it does not have as much weight as it would in sort of a policy debate format, which means that if you made a really bad argument that goes conceded and you don't think you can make that argument well and convincing in order to convince your judge in order to be able to win the round, then you shouldn't make that argument in your closing speech, because any amount of time you spend on it is the amount of time that you are taking away from an argument that you can make that is more persuasive. As a footnote to this, you should also click on the profile of your judge. Many judges have entered judge philosophies into their profile, which means you can read about how exactly they are approaching the debate round. Once you read about your judge, you can figure out if they have a policy background, in which case consensus matter a lot, or if they are just a teacher or someone who's interested in oral communications or a different style of debate. Once you have that, you can have a better understanding of how much a conceded or dropped argument matters in relation to the judge. Again, all judges will care if an opponent is not answering an argument, but some judges will care to a larger extent. And you should keep that in mind in order to be able to figure out whether or not the concession of a bad argument is worth spending any time on versus just going for the time that you want to be able to win the debate round. Now, the second question that you should ask yourself after asking yourself how can you win the round is you need to ask yourself how can you lose the round. A couple things you have to consider in that as well. The first thing you have to consider is what was the best argument the opposition made. This will normally be very clear in the opposition closing because they will tell the judge, "Judge, you should vote for me because," and they will insert the reasons or the arguments that they think why they should win the round. Once you hear those and you've clearly identified those, and I suggest writing them down on a sheet of paper, then you could make sure that you have answers to them so that way you don't lose the round on an argument that they have clearly identified that they want to win on. So if they say, "Judge, you should vote on this argument," you better in your closing speech have an answer to that argument because that's something they want to go for. Another thing that you need to consider are what are the more minor details that matter. These are arguments that they might make in their longer speech that are not emphasized as something that the judge has to vote on, so they won't say something like, "Judge, you should vote on this argument," but is an argument that is important to the thesis that they're making or encountering the thesis that you're making. In doing so, you have to make sure that you answer these minor details so that way the judge doesn't vote on something minor that the opposition didn't emphasize. Again, since the opposition has already given their last speech, this means that you know exactly what they have done and how to respond, whereas they don't know what you're going to do, which means that little details or the arguments that you'll emphasize in relation to them has the strategic benefit of being able to win you the round more effectively because you can line those up more directly to what has been said within their last speech. What I recommend doing in most cases is sort of a 90-second, 30-second division. The 90 seconds should be emphasizing why you win the round, on what arguments you win the round, and then the 30-second division should be on answering your opponent's arguments. The reason why I have this division, and you should keep in mind that this division is not set in stone, so you should not just abide by it just because I said 90 and 30, but it's a rough idea of how you should approach it. But the reason why I suggest this is because it is more important for you to ensure that the judge knows why you should win than why your opponent should lose, or why your opponent is wrong. If the judge does not have a clear understanding or an idea of why you win the debate round, the judge will be unable or incapable of voting for you because they can't say at the end of the debate that you win because. All judges in any format of debate wants to try and remove their own opinion from their decision, which means that they're going to try and vote on only those words that are said by the debaters within the round. That means that you need to utilize that time that you have to go about actually giving the judge the words that they need to say, so that way when you read the decision at the end of the round, most of the decision is your words coming back in the disclosure back to you as a form of feedback. And that's how you know you've done your job well, is if the judge utilizes the same terminology in their decision as you used in your speeches, because it means that you effectively emphasize why you win the round. After you emphasize why you win the round, then you just spend the remainder of your time explaining why you don't lose the round on the things that your opponent have said. One way you do this is you use the reason for why you win the round to answer all of your opponent's other arguments, which means that if you have a certain reason, like that it's important to regulate internet pornography because the negative effects of pornography causes a devaluation of women that re-emphasizes sexism, that makes a culture of rape more likely to happen, you should take that impact and weigh it against any of their other arguments. So if they are emphasizing free speech or e-commerce or whatever else, your first line of defense to all those arguments is that even if that's true, that it is more important for us to be able to take a stance against sexism in a culture that promotes rape than it is to try and uphold a more illusionary value of freedom of speech. Now, the specifics can change regardless of the topic, but the importance of it is to realize that regardless of how it is, or regardless of what the topic is, one of the big things that you need to do is explain why the impacts and the implications of what you're talking about are more important than the implications of what your opponent is talking about. After you make that argument that your opponent's arguments are irrelevant, even if they're entirely correct, that you should win the round because of what you're talking about as being more important or having a larger impact or outweighing or whatever terminology you need to use, then you should provide extra lines of defense against that for why the argument isn't true, i.e. we don't actually violate free speech. E-commerce can happen in other ways. The arguments that you make in your rebuttal where you had more time, you take the best one or two of those, repeat them as additional lines of defense, so that way at the end of the round the judge can say, not only do I think that the proposition outweighs the opposition, but the proposition also has defense to the things that they're talking about. Now, in a lot of ways that debates are evaluated, even in lay styles of debate or even in an online format, is a situation of probability versus magnitude. So you want to emphasize that the impacts or the implications that you're talking about have a larger magnitude, while also minimizing the probability of your opponent's likelihood of their magnitude. Which means that if they're doing things like, if you're saying like corporations shouldn't be allowed to patent life, you should utilize your arguments as a way to outweigh at a magnitudinal level, but then also make secondary arguments that decrease the probability of theirs. I.e., if they say patents are important in order to be able to develop cures, you could then provide examples of where cures have developed without the necessity of patents, which then shows that the probability of needing patents in order to come up with the cures is not actually factually true, which means that you're in a better situation to be able to then win the round as a result, because they have a lower probability and your magnitude is higher. And framing debates in this way makes it very clear to the judge for why they should vote one way versus the other, because not only have you articulated the strength of your arguments, but you've explained the strength of your arguments while minimizing the opponent's arguments simultaneously. When doing this, you need to also be clear on why your arguments are better than your opponent's. That's essentially what a rebuttal or a closing speech does. In order to do that, you could compare the warrants. A lot of times in these debates, especially when crunched for time, people will make claims without warrants. If that's true, you should tell the judge that they have not in any way, shape, or form actually explained why their argument is true. They've just asserted it being true, and then simultaneously make sure that you don't do that same mistake and you provide the warrant for why what you're saying is true. The other thing you can point out is if you have a citation and your opponent doesn't have a citation, or if you both have citations, which citation is more qualified. If you have a more qualified source, that means the judge would prefer your source to their source. And doing that sort of evidence comparison or citation comparison makes it easier for a judge to vote one way versus the other, because otherwise you essentially are relying on the judge to look at both teams' sites and figure out which ones that they believe more, or who does a better job just articulating the warrants independent of what the source actually says or the qualification of that source. Certainly, some people are more qualified to talk than other people. A random blog entry, for instance, wouldn't be as qualified as a professor or an expert in a given field or a government official. Now, there's no explicit hierarchy of what is more qualified of a source than less qualified of a source, but it is something that is germane to debate that should always be argued about, especially within that closing speech, because that way, at the end of the round, not only can the judge say, I vote for you because I think you have the biggest impact and the most likely probability, but also I think that your arguments are more true because the sources that you're citing come from more qualified sources, however those qualified sources might actually be more qualified, and that's up for you to actually be able to explain. Now, while you don't have that much time, it is very, very important that you don't just address the main point of your opponent, but also make sure you don't drop the smaller issues that could be voted on. If your opponent has mentioned anything like you've done something unfair, or that is an independent voting issue, or that this is something that can be looked at independently from the rest of the round, you need to make sure that you explicitly answer that argument, because if you don't explicitly answer that argument, then you'll never know whether or not the judge might actually pull the trigger on that argument. So you need to make sure that you have the coverage. Again, the easiest way to cover these arguments are just explaining why your argument is more important, even if what they're saying might be true. And then, secondly, showing why it wouldn't be true. And in the smaller arguments, you don't have to spend as much time warranting out your answers to it, but judges will not have some sort of comfort to see that there is an answer to the argument, opposed to seeing it be entirely conceded, and then having the judge be like, well, I sort of vote this way. Fortunately, within the online format, a lot of people don't make a huge diversity of arguments, which means that you can make sure that you have effective coverage on those arguments that are actually being made despite the time differential, because you'll be able to know the arguments that they've made, whereas they had a guess at the arguments that you would go for. What's important, though, is that Remember, in your closing speech, you cannot make new arguments that were not present in your rebuttal speech or your constructive speech. All you could do is make comparative analysis at this point. However, that means that when you start speaking in your closing speech, you should reference your earlier speeches and say, like, remember the evidence that I cited in my constructive or my rebuttal. Remember this argument that I made here. And then explain how the opposition mishandled that argument, or why that argument is still true in relation to things that they have said. So you still need to sort of do the line drawing for judges, but when you do that sort of line drawing for judges, you need to make sure that it's done in a way that is effective, so that way you're not wasting your time sort of slowly figuring out how to cite the piece of evidence or the argument that you made beforehand, but clear enough so that way the judge knows that it is not a new argument. Now, one of the things that's also nice about having the closing speech is that the other team does not have the opportunity to point out new arguments that you may have made, which means, to a certain extent, you can make new arguments, but only insofar as you can make them appear not new arguments, which means that you have to point to something that was said prior and then utilize those words to explain how it actually means this other thing that answers what it is that they're saying. Now, I wouldn't say you should lie about your arguments. However, when people make arguments, there's often numerous ways of understanding what's being said, which means that you have the ability to interpret what you had said prior for the judge in order to mean something else. Now, when you do these sort of things, it is up to the judge then to determine whether or not what you've done is new or not new. So if you are trying to sort of bend the words that you have said to sort of say something different, you need to sort of make it clear that it's not a new argument, otherwise the judge could simply discount it on their own sort of ability to adjudicate by believing that it is a new argument, which wouldn't be allowed within the closing speech. So, when doing these things, you have to keep in mind sort of the blurred line of what constitutes new and not new, and not necessarily step over that line, but recognize that there is a big gray area where it could be new or it could not be new. Lastly, ethos matters within the online format because the online format has a large extent to do with how persuasive you are as a speaker, while backed up with the evidence and the citations and the qualifications that you've used to make your arguments. That means that when you conclude your speech, you want to conclude strong because it's the last words that the judge will hear before deciding how they want to evaluate the debate round and filling out the ballot. When you can make this strong conclusion, you should restate your thesis and not forget your original proposition argument, right? Which means that if you had a specific plan about how to go about doing something, or if you had a specific policy or specific definitions of terms, you should not assume that the judge and everyone remembers what was said in that initial speech, however many minutes ago that was that they've watched it. Rather, you should restate exactly what the judge is voting on and why they're voting on it in a very clear way in your conclusion. Because if you fail to do that, that conclusion will never be something that would be fully effective because they wouldn't remember what it is that they're voting on. So, at the end of your speech, you should remind the judge, if you vote affirmative, you are voting for, and then explain what they are voting for as a result of what you are actually advocating. If you get stuck into a situation where all you're doing is answering your opponent, answer, you don't have a thesis that the judge could vote at the end, which means that even if you're good at answering your opponent, at the end of the round, if they don't know why to vote for you, they just know why to not vote against you. And that is oftentimes not enough if the opposition has done their job explaining why they should be voted for, which means that you need to have that strong conclusion. And I would actually recommend bookending your speech. That way you start strong with your thesis and you end strong with your thesis by explaining why it is that you win the round. And utilize that so that way when the judge goes into entering the ballot, it is very clear within their minds why it is that you should win, given what's taken place in the debate round and given the way that you're framing the debate. The benefit of the proposition is that you have the first and last speeches, which means you have already controlled the format and the form and the means of how the debate is understood. The opposition's benefit is that they have more time. You need to be able to effectively beat back that time by utilizing those last words in the debate round to leave a lasting impact in the judge's mind, so that way when they go ahead and they actually start filling out and signing their ballot, they know why it should be a proposition victory, because you framed for that judge why it is you deserve to win the round in light of the things that the other team has said, and reasons why what the other team has said that's incorrect, but always emphasizing first and foremost why it is that what you're saying is correct and should win you the round. which is why the first question that you have to ask yourself was, how can you win the round? / what's your best argument and what do they screw up on? And then utilizing that argument as your first line of defense and offense against everything else that your opponent has said, so that way the judge could be like, again, even if the opposition wins this claim, it does not mean they win the round, because the proposition has already explained in that last speech that they deserve to win regardless of the truth of the opposition's claim, because they have the biggest implication that are the most important thing to actually be focused on. So you should utilize that impact analysis and make sure that it's very clear for the judge what they're voting on and why they should be voting for that in terms of sequencing the way the ballot should be understood. If you have any questions or like additional feedback, please don't hesitate to post comments on this section, and I will continue to reply. And it could also be an ongoing conversation for everyone who's actually watched this lecture in order to be able to give tips and tactics that they've utilized within online formats that would be successful in order to be able to help other people to continue to make the online format a more vibrant form of debate and online form of conversation. Thank you.